friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using the new Autumn Days stamp set from Hello Bluebird. So I've stamped those images out on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn jet black ink, and I'll be coloring with my Copic markers. I'm starting with my girl's skin, and for that I'm using E000, E00, and E11. So I'm taking that E11 first and doing some shadows up under her hairline, on the tops of her ears, side of her nose, the top of her neck, and then on her hand as well. And then I'll blend that out with the E00. And then I'll come in with the E000 and fill in the lower part of her face and neck and her fingers. And then I'll also use a little bit of the E00 and E000 on the top of the stump. You're barely going to see that in the card. She's going to be sitting on it, so I just used a tiny bit there. And then I'm going to give her some rosy cheeks using RV10 and RV11. Then I'm going to move on to her hair, and I wanted her to be a brunette. I'm going to use E50s. I'm using E51, E53, E55, E57, and E59. And this is pretty much the only time that I color lightest to darkest, because I tend to be a little heavy-handed with my coloring. So I like to start light on the hair so I don't lose all the texture, and I can build in those lowlights by adding in those darker shades. So I started with the E51 and kind of mapped out where I want all of the dark places to eventually go, mostly just following the artist drawn lines, but then also adding in a few extra strokes of my own. And then I'm going to deepen that up with each consecutive color. So I used the E53 next, and now I'm moving on to the E55, just darkening that with each pass as I go progressively darker with the marker colors. So if you wanted her to be more of like a blonde, you could actually just stop with the E55 and then work your way back down, and you would get a very pretty blonde color. But I wanted to go a little bit darker in this scene, so I decided to continue using that E57, and now I'm coming in with the darkest, which is the E59, and just being real sparing with that, using the very tip of the marker and quick light strokes so that I just get the barest amount of that. A little goes a long way with those super dark colors like the E59. And now I'm going to work my way back down in the reverse. So I'm going in next with the E57, just drawing those colors out, making those lines a little bit longer, occasionally adding a few extra lines in between the other ones, just whatever I think, is going to fill that in nicely and give me a lot of texture. This image is fantastic for practicing your coloring. The way that her hair is pulled up in that top knot is really easy to practice your strokes. So if you're somebody who is new to coloring hair, or you just feel like you're not getting the hang of it, this image is a really good one for practice. I think it works great. So I'm just going my way back down again, all the way down to the E51, and then I'm going to assess it. And I felt like there was still too much variation between the lightest colors and the darkest colors. So I'm going back to my mid-tone, the E55, and adding a few extra strokes of that, just darkening it up slightly. And then I'll go back in with the E51, my lightest shade, to blend that back into the rest of the hair. And then I'm going to call that good. Then I'm going to keep those lightest three shades and add in one lighter, adding in the E50. And I'm going to do my tree trunk. So I'm going to start with the E55. I'm going to do a slightly deeper shadow on the right hand side, since that's the side where all the little grooves are drawn in, and then a thinner shadow on the left hand side to give it that rounded look. And then I'm going to blend that out with the E53. Then I'll come in with the E51 and pull that color even further toward the center, and then finally come in with the E50 to fill that in. And I am doing 2 additional trees off screen, which I'll show you later on. While I have these colors out, I'm also going to do the stems of my pumpkins using the E55 and the E53. And I also wanted to color in the lower part of my acorn. So again, I'll start with that E55. I'm going to put the shadow on the left-hand side where the chipmunk's body would be casting a shadow as it's holding it, and then blend toward the lower right corner. I'm also going to use these shades for the tree stump. So again, I'm starting with that darkest color, the E55, and drawing in a few lines here to indicate that there are some grooves, just following those artist drawn lines once again and making sure to have some shadows on the left and the right side again. And then I'll blend that out with the E53, just taking that out a little bit farther, but still leaving plenty of room for the lighter 2 shades. So next I'll use the E51, and I'm going to fill in that even further. So there's only going to be a little bit of the E50 on there, but having all that range of colors just really helps to give it more of a dynamic look because it is a large surface area. And I did toss a little E50 onto the top as well to mute that down. Then I'm going to keep the E55 and add in the E57 and E59, and I will do the top of my acorn, the little cap. Again, having my shadows on the left-hand side because the chipmunk would be casting a shadow there. And I didn't feel like there was enough shading on those pumpkin stems, so I did throw in a little E57 and then blend it out with that E55. Next, I'm going to move on to a red combo. I'm going to use R35, R37, and R39 for her little cardigan sweater. It's kind of like a cranberry red, which I think goes really well for fall. So I'm taking that R39 first and laying in my shadows, again using very sparing little lines there because it is a very dark color, but just drawing in those creases where the fabric is kind of bunched by how she's sitting, and also where her arm is overlapping the rest of the material. And then I'm going to blend that out with the E37, still sticking pretty close to the outside edge, so I'll have plenty of room for that lightest shade, the R35, to fill the rest of that in so it still looks nice and bright and has that cranberry red tone to it. So I'm just going to continue filling that in carefully around those buttons. And then I also wanted to carry that color over into one of the leaves. So I'm just going to pick one of the maple looking leaves and I'll add that R39 in again and then blend that out with the R37. And then I'll use the R35 to kind of fill in the edges where the light would be coming through the most. So you could color her legs in to be flesh toned, but I decided to give her some leggings since this is a fall scene. I wanted to keep her looking nice and warm. Also, it's another opportunity for color in a scene. So I'm going to go with a lighter version of her sweater to make them look a bit more transparent. So I kept the R35, which was the lightest on her sweater, and then added in the R32 and the R30, put a little shadow up under her skirt and where her kneecaps are, and then the R30 kind of pressed the R32 back a bit, so I did go back in with a second layer of that mid-tone. And then I just worked over that a little bit until I was happy with the results. And then I'm going to do another one of the leaves with this combo. So starting with the R35 and then blending out with the R32 and using the R30 at the tips like I mentioned. And then I'm also going to throw this color into the tree as well. I wanted it to be one of those trees. I see them a lot near my house that have really dark reddish leaves, almost going into like a purple tone. So I wanted to have a bit of variation in there though, so I'm going to mix a few colors to get that look. So next I'm going to move on to some desaturated purples or desaturated reds, I guess technically, because they are RVs, they're red violets. So I'm using RV93, RV95, and RV99. But you can definitely see that they read more purple toned. They're like a plum shade. So I used the RV99 up under her cardigan sweater, gave it a bit of shadow there, and I'm blending out toward the top of her knees where it would get the most light. And then I'm also going to throw some of this into the leaves, starting again with that RV99 and then blending out with the RV95 and then using RV93 if it fits. Some of the leaves were a bit too small. And I wanted her collar to match her skirt, so I just used the darkest two shades for that, since it would be more shadowed from her head. And then I did the third leaf that's kind of set apart at the top with this combo as well, just to have another spot of purple in this scene. Moving on to some more browns using E74, E77, and E79. I'm going to do her boots with this combo, adding that E79 toward the back and then blending forward with the E77, and then I'll use the E74 at the front there. I like these browns because they have almost like a plummy undertone as well, so I think they go really well with this particular combination of colors that I'm using. I'm also going to use this for the top of the chipmunk's body, adding that to the top stripe of his tail and then the stripe that goes down the back of his head and over his ears. Just using the darkest in the creases and then the lightest, that E74, where his head is the widest, right over his ears. And then I'm going to switch to W00, E70, and E71 for the little mouse. I've really been loving this combo for mice lately. So starting with the E71 and then blending out with the E70. And then I saved a little room on his face and belly and the inside of his ears for that W00. And then I'm going to switch up to more warm grays, keeping that W00, but adding in W1, W3, and W5 for the squirrel. Even though I love red squirrels the most, they are my favorite animal, I just felt like the gray tones fit more with this color palette. I thought kind of like the reddish browns might be a bit jarring since all of the browns that I've used were more kind of like creamy or desaturated. So I just decided to go with some grays for him. So I use the W5 in his darkest little crevices, like the place between his tail and the back of his body, down the back of his head, the underside of his arms, and then blend it out with the W3 and then the W1. And the only place I put the W00 was at the very top of his tail and on his face and belly. And then I also put a little W1 and W00 on the middle stripe on the chipmunk. And then for the rest of the chipmunk, I decided to go back to my E50s. And I'm using E53, E55, and E57 for that, the lower part of him on the bottom stripe on his tail. And I just put the E57 at the base of his tail, the underside of his arm, and then down by his feet, and then blend it up with the E55, and then use the E53 on his belly and the lower part of his muzzle. And then I'm going to move on to my pumpkins. I'm using YR12, YR14, and YR18 for both of them. So starting with the YR18 on the larger one and just tracing over the artist drawn lines to really emphasize those creases, also adding a little shading around that leaf where it would be casting a shadow. And then I'll come in with the YR14. I want to stick pretty close to the lines though and leave lots of room for the highlight shade. Because these pumpkins I'm doing both in the same combo, I still wanted them to look slightly different. So I'm using more of the YR12 on the larger one, and then when I do the smaller one, I'm going to be a lot more heavy-handed with those darker shades. So I'm going in with that YR18 again, and then I'm going to use the YR14 to mostly fill it in, and then the only place I'll use the YR12 is that center highlight on the center section. Moving on to another red combo, but I wanted it to be slightly different than the ones that I've used before. This is almost in the middle between the red and the purplish tone that I've used before. It's R46, R56, and R59. I'm going to do the leaf on the pumpkin and all the rest of the leaves on the trees. And then I'll come in and give all of my critters some rosy cheeks, going back to the same combo that I used on the girl with the RV10 and the RV11. And then I also did give the mouse and the squirrel some pink in the insides of their ears. The chipmunk, he was just too dark to bother, so I didn't add it to him. And then I'm going to grab a black Sakura Jelly Roll pen and go over the eyes of all of my critters and the girl. It's kind of tricky on these smaller critters, but I managed to get it on there. And then I trim the images out with their matching dies. For the background, I'm starting with a piece of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock, and I'm using the Lawn Fawn Cloudy Stencil to blend on some Spun Sugar Distress Oxide ink. I wanted to go with a pink sunset sky. I just thought that would be pretty with the color palette that I've already got going on. I didn't have any blue in the scene, so I just decided to go pink. So I'm going to add 2 cloud formations with this shade, just turning that stencil so that I get a different variation of it, so that all of the little scallops look different. And then I'm going to turn it once again, but this time I'm going to deepen up that pink slightly by adding in some Kitsch Flamingo. So I'm going to go right off the stencil with that, just using a little bit of ink. I don't want to go too bold with this, but I just wanted there to be a bit of variation in the sky. And then I'll grab my Spun Sugar ink blending tool and just blend that out a bit to soften it. I'll add a bit more color down at the bottom edge. And then I also wanted to do some splatter detail on there to give it a bit more movement. So I'm going to press some of that Kitsch Flamingo onto an acrylic block, water it down to make it a bit more fluid, and then I'll pick that up with a thin paintbrush and tap it off the side so I get a nice fine splattering of dots. I'm not going to go too crazy with this because I also wanted to add some shimmer to the background. So I'm going to grab my Gansai Tambi Starry Colors and I'm going to mix up this coppery shade, which I think works really well for fall, and I'm going to splatter that on the background as well. Then I've die cut 2 more panels of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock using the Grassy Knoll dies from Hello Bluebird, and I'm going to blend on some Bundled Sage Distress Oxide ink. So I'm just going to do one at a time there and try to be careful not to bend those grasses down. I did get one kind of bent at the edge, but I had to trim it down slightly, so that was fine. But I was more careful after that, especially on the second one. So I'm going to blend that down probably a little bit more than halfway. And then I want to deepen that up a bit. So I'm going to bring in some Rustic Wilderness. And I'll bring that up from the bottom. So I'm just going to work my way up. This is a much darker color, but I wanted to get that richness of tone at the bottom there. And then I'll go back to my Bundled Sage Distress Oxide blending tool and just smooth over the transition between there. I did need to go back in with a bit more ink because these shades are pretty far apart on, the spectrum. I did add a bit more of the darkness, just worked my way back and forth until I was happy with the blend. And then I'm going to do the same for the second panel. So just adding that Rustic Wilderness down about the bottom half and then going back to the Bundled Sage tool to mix those together. And then once I'm happy with both of these, I did want to do some splatter on these as well. So I'm just going to use the Rustic Wilderness for that and repeat the same process, pressing it onto a block and then mixing that up with some water, tapping it over the side. And then I also wanted to add the same coppery tone to that as well. So I'm going to go back to my Gansai Tambi Starry colors. And it had thickened up again by then, so I had to add a little more water and then splattered that all over both of those grassy panels. And then I'm going to let all of these 3 pieces dry completely. Once they have, I can start to assemble the background. So I'm going to add one of these grassy panels behind the other. And it ended up actually covering up the Kitsch Flamingo that I had added to the scene. So that wasn't my intention from the beginning, or I probably would have moved that up higher on the background. But in the end, it's fine. I just added the liquid glue to the first section down at the very bottom so that I would have room to slip the top section in. And then I'm going to bring in the trees from my scene because I want to have those adhered to the card before I stamp my sentiment so that I can place my sentiment just perfectly. So I'm going to take 2 of these and adhere them over on the left-hand side, just tucking them down into the grass. And I'm trying to give them like a little bit of a twist so that they don't look identical. Like for the second one, I'm going to tuck the small branch kind of behind the first one and, just try to give it like a different look so they aren't so identical to make it look like, just 2 trees growing side by side. And then I'm going to take the third tree and I'll glue that down over on the right-hand side. And the reason I hadn't colored the grasses in before was because I didn't even know if they were going to show, so I didn't bother. But now I can see that this one is going to show, so I need to color that in. So I'm going to grab my G46 and add a bit of that first. And then I'll blend that out with G43, which is a pretty good match for those 2 shades of Distress Oxide ink. So now that I have those on there, I can stamp my sentiment because I want it to be even between those 2 sections of trees. So I'm stamping Autumn Greetings with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And it stamped perfectly the first time, so I'm going to leave it at that. Especially since it's such a delicate font, I didn't want to like overpower it with too much ink. And then on the inside of the card, I'm going to stamp in Lawn Fawn bubblegum ink, and I'm stamping the other little girl and another leaf and a sentiment that says, "For my friend," and that card base is Lawn Fawn speckled eggshell cardstock. So I trimmed that background piece to be just slightly smaller than the card front, so that I can have just a little bit of a frame on the outside edges. I'm going to glue that down with my Barely Art Precision Craft Glue, and then I'm going to figure out the placement of the girl and the stump before I go ahead and glue that stump into place. It's going to be kind of at the base of the second tree on the left, and then I'll put the girl sitting on that so you can see she almost completely covers the top of that stump, but that's totally fine. And then I'm going to take the little critters and have them kind of like spaced around her. So I'm going to do the mouse on the pumpkin next, and then I'll have the squirrel over on the right hand side. So again, just making sure I have my placement how I want it before I commit, since this glue dries so quickly. So I'll go ahead and get my pumpkin with the mouse on it, which I just adore that mouse. I think he is so super darling. I love super cute tiny images. They just always capture my heart. I put the smaller pumpkin in front of the larger one, and then on the left hand side of the card I'll have the squirrel with his little acorn. And then I'm going to take those 3 colored leaves and just kind of add them here and there in the scene so that we have more pops of color, you know, kind of spread around, and kind of breaking up things, like tucking that red leaf in between the brown of the nut and the brown of the stump. Just breaks up that color and gives you another fresh pop of something else there. And then the last leaf I kind of put between the 2 pumpkins. But I didn't like how empty the center of the card was looking right under that sentiment. So I decided to stamp out 3 more leaves and color those in. So I'm going to do the small one as if it's kind of like drifting down from that tree on the right hand side. And then I was just trying to figure out where exactly I wanted the other 2 leaves to go. And I kind of fooled around with them a bit, trying them in different places to see how I like them. But in the end, I ended up going back with my first instinct, which was to put the pinkish one in the center and then the purplish one over on the left-hand side. So I'm going to tuck that purple one in between the grass and the tree. Just kind of slipping it back there as if it's kind of caught at the base of the tree. And then this small one I'm going to put in the air like I mentioned. And then this pinkish one I'll have as if it's kind of blowing around in the background there. So all that's left is to add a bit of sparkle. I'm going to use my favorite Stardust Stickles for that. And I'm just going to add it to all of the leaves, kind of down the center stem of them, and using the nozzle to spread it out a bit. So I did it to all of the leaves that are kind of blowing around, and then also just a touch of it to all the leaves on the trees as well. So once I have all of those leaves, I did have to kind of turn the card to get to the ones on the right hand side so I don't drag my hand in it. But that is going to finish off this card. So I'm going to lift that up to the camera so you can see all of that sparkle and all of the shine from that Gansai Tambi Starry Colors. And then there's another peek at the inside as well. Can't wait to use that girl on the inside on a card of her own. If you enjoyed this one, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a video. I post new ones every Monday and Friday. All of these products will be listed and linked for you in the description bar below, and if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos that I thought you might also enjoy. You can click on either one to check them out. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I hope you had a good time, and I'll see you soon in another video. Bye-bye.